Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Dumelo Mosaka. I'm the director of the Mellon Arts Project located within the African American and African Diaspora Studies Department at Columbia University. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's program and the Mellon Arts Project. Mellon Arts Project was launched in 2020 to highlight the value of the artists as both an educational resource and as an effective tool for social change. Tonight's program is part of a series called the Black Arts Dialogue, focused on in-depth conversations with artists from various disciplines. Tonight's guest is a very special and important artist, Delroy Lindo. The program is hosted and curated by the author Ayana Mathis, whose book, The 12 Tribes of Hatti, received New York Times Bestseller Award and was also chosen to be part of Oprah Winfrey's book club. Without any further ado, I want to hand this over to Ayana and Delroy to take us through this journey. Thank you.
Hello, hello. Hello, Delroy.
Hello, Ayana. How are you?
Welcome. I'm so glad to have you here. Thank you for doing this. You're in the midst of a flurry of intense activity and creativity. So I'm so thankful to you for making the time.
God bless. Thanks for having me.
I'm going to do a little brief introduction. It's impossible to do it justice. So it's going to be a whirlwind tour. We are very lucky to have Delroy here with us today. Film, television, theater, all of the above. I'm just going to do a brief and spotty list of incredible films in which he's been. There are his 4 Spike Lee films, of course, Clockers, Malcolm X, the beloved Crooklyn, most recently The Five Bloods. I'm not going in order. So we've also got amazing films like The Soul of the Game, in which he starred as the Negro League's star Satchel Paige, Get Shorty, Ransom, The Cider House Rules. It goes on and on. Television, a long history there, most recently The Good Fight, most notably for maybe people who have kids out there, The Simpsons. I did an episode of The Simpsons. That always makes kids happy. And of course, a long history as well in the theater. August Wilson's Joe Turner's Come and Gone, A Raisin in the Sun twice, Othello. Delroy's also been a director in the theater, The Blue Door, Othello, and Medal of Honor, Rag. So that's just a little bit. I'm not going to touch on the upcoming stuff because I'm hoping that we'll be able to talk about that a little bit at the end of the hour. But in any case, thank you so much, Delroy. And I before we even get started, just to people know your face and they know your name so well, but I want to cue a little clip. It's just a little bit of a reel that's going to be kind of montage of some different films to set the tone and get us in the mood.
Broken man. Broken. Look, we all broken. Not like me.
You killed my father and mother.
You don't know nothing about me, nigga.
He has PTSD.
There you go. Come on. I see ghosts, y'all.
So I never said nothing to you about shooting nobody. All I said, you want that spot, you got to get it for yourself.
Have some coffee and cake.
Have some.
You have a big mouth.
Everybody says that about me.
Think about my life. I must have made more mistakes than herding sheep. You know what was my biggest? I should have listened to you and I didn't. Satchel Paige should have listened to Josh Gibson.
Trisha, I want you in my life. Now you know there are people out there, they're gonna try to hurt me by hurting you. I'll be damned if I let them do that.
I wasn't gonna shoot you, man. It was just my rep.
I'm just trying to put things straight. Sometimes you gotta break some rules, put things straight.
I will choose when and how.
share is my share. You do what you want with his share. Hear me? Norman wouldn't want us to split up. That's right. He wouldn't. And that's my problem. That's my problem, Otis.
So that was just a really quick kind of run through, or overview even, I suppose we could call it. So it's hard to figure out. I spent so much time in preparing for this talk with you this evening to kind of figure out how to talk with someone who has had such a long career and such a varied career. So one of the things that I started to think about was how do we create some order in this conversation so that it makes sense? And I was going back and I was looking at interviews you'd done and things like that. And I came across one that you did sort of recently. And you told a great story about being very, very, very young actor, sort of super green, and talking with a casting director. And the casting director asked you where you saw yourself in 5 years.
Oh, yeah.
And you said, and you're kind of like, well, I don't know, but I want to be respected as an actor. And it was very funny because you said the casting director was like, okay, all right, whatever, you know.
Exactly. Yeah.
And one of the things I thought about was that, you know, respect involves a whole lot of things, right? That's like your sort of position in the field. It's your sense of your own self, your work, your growth as an artist, money. I mean, it's all kinds of things, this idea of respect. And so I kind of wanted to think about a little bit about what that meant to you at the time that you said it. And so that's sort of the first thing that I want to ask you. And I want us, you and I, and also those who are out there watching us tonight, to kind of keep that in mind, because at the end of the hour, I'd sort of like to circle back to it and see if what that meant to you then has changed over the years. So let's start there. When you said that to her all those years ago, what was in your mind?
Perhaps the reason that the casting person rolled her eyes is because she was thinking that's what everybody says, right? And also it was it's in the context of having not done anything at that point as an actor, it's kind of general. And perhaps, you know, this casting director was perceiving what I was saying as kind of pie in the sky. So to your question, I'm not really sure what I thought it meant, other than that I would have a career at all. And you've got to remember, I hadn't done anything when I said that, right? But I guess it was an aspirational comment having to do with what I thought I wanted, which is to have a career, to work as an actor, and to have people respond positively to what I did as an actor.
So it's also a good place for us to start, because it takes, I want to start a little bit at the beginning, but in a really whirlwind sort of way. So I'm going to take us back. So you sort of realized pretty early on that you're interested in acting and that you want to be an actor, like a little boy, like really young.
Yeah.
And at that time you're living in London, right?
Correct.
Where you sort of spent your kind of formative years, doing various things, you know, that kids do, right? And then I'm going to fast forward us enormously to the early 70s. Excuse me. And in the early 70s, you leave England and you come to the US, to New York specifically. And there you're still sort of nurturing this dream and thinking about this very much. And you begin to, among some very small TV things like this, you start working in the theater. And so one of the things that I wanted to ask you about was that sort of your experience as a Black actor in the 1980s in the world of Black theater and the Black theater scene in general, you know, because I think the 1980s in New York is sort of iconic, right? But there's always this, sort of Basquiat was at the party in the loft with Madonna, and Keith Haring was there, and all this kind of business, right? But
just so you know, I was not at that party.
No, I know. They seem really great parties, though, right?
They were probably wonderful parties. I was not at any of those parties, but please continue.
But that's exactly the point I want to make. I think there was a whole other party. There's a whole other New York 1980s that's going on. Yeah. And I think that the Black theater scene, there's all kinds of really interesting people there. You were there,
Yeah.
But it hasn't made it into this sort of iconic memories of New York of that period. So I just wanted you to talk, like, who was there? What were y'all doing?
Yeah. I have to say to you that it's iconic in my mind, and I'll tell you why. First of all, just a slight correction. When I left England, I actually made a stop in Canada, in Toronto, which is where my mom was living. And I kind of, for a minute, was going back and forth. I would scurry off to New York City from Toronto. And that's important because the reason that that's important, that those journeys from Toronto to New York are important, is because on one of those journeys, and I have said this numerous times over the years, on one of those trips, and it was Easter of 1973 or 74. I think it was 73, but it was Easter. And I came to New York and I saw the Negro Ensemble Company production of the River Niger. And that transformed my world. I have to, let me just say this. I saw on that trip, the NAC Broadway production, the Negro Ensemble Company Broadway production of the River Niger. I also went to the Manhattan Theater Club, and I saw 2 one-act plays. The actors in those plays, Bill Cobbs, who was went on to become a very, very well-respected New York actor, and Brent Jennings, likewise, very well-respected New York theater actor. So those 2 productions, and I should say that the play that I saw at the Manhattan Theater Club, 2 one-acts, one was called The Past is the Past by Richard Wesley. And the other one, I don't remember. I think it was called Breakout. But here's my point. And they were 2 one-acts featuring Brent and Bill Cobbs. But here's my point. At the end of that trip, having seen the 2 one-acts at the Manhattan Theater Club, but more especially for me, going to Broadway and seeing Black actors on stage and seeing so many Black people in the audience. I had never seen anything like that. In the audience. I had never seen anything like that before. And I left the theater with a much more tangible sense, maybe I can have a career as an actor. That was an epiphany. It was transformative for me. As a result of that, that seed being planted, maybe I can do this. Maybe I can really do this. I can do what I just saw these other Black actors doing on stage. But the Broadway aspect, because, as we know, Broadway is the pinnacle, is considered the pinnacle of what one can achieve in New York theater. There I was in a Broadway theater, seeing Black actors on stage amongst an audience that contained lots of Black people. And it made it all tangible for me and graspable. Now, to your question about the iconic aspect, for me as a young actor, it didn't get any more iconic than the Negro Ensemble Company. And I don't know who I don't know who all is watching this, but for those of you who do not know about the Negro Ensemble Company, started by, I want to get this, Douglas Stone Award and Robert Hooks, I believe. And that theater, the Negro Ensemble Company, was formed, and I'm getting a little bit out of my depth right now, but I'll say what I recall, what I think I recall. In the late 1950s, there was a seminal production of a play called The Blacks. In that production, now we're talking about icons. This is to your point about icons. In that production were Roscoe Lee Brown, James Earl Jones, Cecily Tyson, Louis Gossett Jr., icons. And I don't know exactly what the trajectory was, but out of that production of The Blacks in the late 1950s in New York, a few years later, the Negro Ensemble Company was formed. For me as a young, aspiring actor, NEC, as we called it, as we affectionately called it, NEC, was the pinnacle of achievement. That one could, if one could get into NEC, there were also people like Lloyd Richards, another icon for the theater. Lloyd Richards was the original director of Lorraine Hansberry's A Raisin in the Sun. Lloyd was connected to the NEC. Another brilliant actor named Mary Alice, another iconic New York City actor. For me, aspiring to have a career and have a career in the theater, it didn't get any more iconic than the Negro Ensemble Company. So that was part of that was the influence of NEC for me when I saw them in 1973, the Broadway production of the River Niger. And then years later, when I came back to New York from California, having studied at the American Conservatory Theater, I had 2 auditions set up. The first was what we in the theater call a general audition. It was not for anything specific. You would go in and you would present 2, a comedic piece and a dramatic piece to the casting directors at these theaters. And I came to New York in August of 1979 from California, from San Francisco, and I auditioned for I did a general audition for the Negro Ensemble Company, and I did a general audition for the New York Shakespeare Festival. So, and 6 weeks later, I got a call from the casting director at the New York Shakespeare Festival to come and understudy for a play called Spell Number 7 by Ntozake Shange, another icon. Ntozake Shange is the writer of For Colored Girls, who have considered Suicide When the Rainbow Is Enough. In the company that I went into understudy for at the New York Shakespeare Festival, Avery Brooks had been associated with that company. Denzel Washington had been associated with that company. Sam and LaTanya Jackson, to name a few. So when we talk about icons, these are some of the individuals, the iconic individuals that I was kind of, rubbing shoulders with, aspiring to be in their company, aspiring to do that kind of work. So my formative years as a New York theater actor were full of these kinds of iconic individuals and these iconic companies, and subsequently these iconic experiences with iconic people. And of course, going much further ahead, reteaming with Lloyd Richards, James Earl Jones, August Wilson, as my theater career started. So it was full of icons. I'm very long-winded, Ayana.
No, this is tremendous. Well, we know. So Delroy, third secret, Delroy and I have had some conversations on the phone. So we're used to talking to each other at this point.
Yes.
No, I thank you for that, because part of what I was thinking was, I always have this sort of idea where I'm like, how can we legend build? There are these legendary stories around. That's why I mentioned the whole, and Jean-Michel Basquiat was at the party with Madonna in the loft, whatever. these things become like legendary in the public imagination, and there's all this other amazing stuff that isn't. And so I'm glad that you gave such a detailed.
And I cannot stress enough, and I do not believe I'm the only actor influenced like this. I can't stress enough how fundamentally, elementally important these kinds of experiences, when I talk about the production of The Blacks, which of course I did not see, but the history was there. It was part of the lore of theater. It was part of the history. And of course, one knew these wonderful actors. Speaking about James Earl Jones, for instance, many years later, when I worked with James Earl, I had been, and I'm jumping ahead now to the early 1980s, when I had been hired as an understudy again on the Broadway production of Master Harold and the Boys by Athol Fugard. And I was and James Earl was in the process of replacing Zakes Mokai, wonderful South African actor who had won a Tony Award for his performance in Master Harold and the Boys. Zakes was leaving. James Earl Jones was coming in to replace Zakes, and I was the understudy, one of the understudies in the company. So I got to work with James in what's called in the theater a put-in rehearsal. It's the process in which a new actor is acclimated into the play before he or she goes on to actually perform. So in the afternoons, we would do these put-in rehearsals. Lloyd Richards directed the put-in rehearsals, and I remember I was in the theater, and the stage door opened, and walking down the hallway towards me was James Earl Jones. And I was about to start working James Earl Jones. Icons. And I just cannot stress enough how fundamental and elemental the impact on me as a young actor being presented with this kind of an experience. One doesn't necessarily at the time, Ayana, know that one is having a kind of an epiphany. One is having a transformative moment. One doesn't necessarily assess it in those kinds of terms, but in retrospect, that is absolutely what all of those experiences represented for me. And they're all part of the building blocks, right, that one uses to build one's career, to build one's journey as an actor. And I would lastly, and then I'll stop talking. I would say that critically at that point in time, and we're talking, the early mid 1980s, the period that you're referencing, my aspiration was to work in the theater.
That was a question, actually, what a question that I had. So at that point, it was really about theater for you. Okay.
I wanted to work in the theater because, and again, if ever you speak with Sam or Denzel or any of these actors that came along at the same time that my career was just starting, out of the 60s and the 70s, and companies like the Negro Ensemble Company, and there was a company, there were Black theater companies all over the country. There was John Allen in Philadelphia had his company. Robert Hooks then started a company in Washington, D.C. There were these companies, right? And I had the ethos that I operated from was that the theater could change the world. The theater could change the world. And I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to be part of being a part of any theater, any kind of storytelling that could change the world. And that was part of the tradition that had been established through the late 50s and the 60s and the 70s on into the 80s. And that was the tradition that I aspired to. I wanted to be a part of that. And I believed it. I believed it. And so that was part of the driving force that fueled me in my work as a theater actor.
And in fact, you were part of it. I mean, we have a great picture of you. There it is, right? In Joe Turner's Come and Gone.
Yeah.
And you've talked a lot about your work and experience in that play.
Yes.
And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit about why that particular experience was so significant to you. What about it was so very,
Absolutely. First of all, I can't speak about my work in Joe Turner's Come and Gone, which, as the caption says, I started in 1986, and 5 productions later, we ended up on Broadway in the spring of 1988. But I can't speak about my experience with Joe Turner's Come and Gone without including my experience working as Walter Lee Younger in A Raisin in the Sun. Because those two, between 1986 and 1988, I did 2 major productions at the Kennedy Center and then at the Wilshire Theater in Los Angeles of playing Walter Lee Younger in A Raisin in the Sun, directed by Harold Scott. Talk about icons. Hal, affectionately known as Hal, we all called him Hal Scott.
Right.
Hal Scott had been very close with Lorraine Hansberry, to the point where Lorraine Hansberry wrote the part of Eric in her play Les Blancs, which is a wonderful play. She wrote the part of Eric for Hal Scott. Hal directed me in this production of A Raisin in the Sun. After my first production of Joe Turner in the fall of 1986 up in Boston, I didn't originate the part. Charles Dutton originated the part of Herald Loomis. And I had seen the production, the original production at Yale Repertory Theater. Rock Dutton's film career was taking off at that point. He left the production. Lloyd Richards called me, asked me to come in and audition. I auditioned for the part of Herald Loomis, and Lloyd cast me. So in the fall of 1986, I went up to Boston, replacing Charles Dutton, Rock Dutton, in my first production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone. I knew from having seen the production at Yale that this was a gargantuan piece of work. When I first saw the play, when Rock Dutton had done it, I was working in New York with a company of actors, and I'd gone up to Yale to see the production. I came back the following morning and I said, you guys, I saw this play last night up at Yale, Joe Turner's Come and Gone by August Wilson. And one of my castmates said, what was it about? And I said, I don't know. But you gotta go see it.
I don't know.
I did not know what the play was about. What I knew was I'd had this, it had hit me viscerally, profoundly. And I knew this was a huge work, a work for the ages. So that when I now started working on Herald Loomis, the part of Herald Loomis in Joe Turner's Come and Gone, I knew I was working in a play for the ages. I knew that. I knew that in my gut. So I did the first production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone in the fall of 1986. I then got a call from Robert Nemiroff, who had been married to Lorraine Hansberry, and they were taking a production of A Raisin in the Sun to the Kennedy Center. They lost the actor who was playing Walter Lee. They lost that actor. Robert Nemiroff called me and said, would you like to do this? I said, of course I would. Yes. So I went from Joe Turner's Come and Gone to the Kennedy Center production of A Raisin in the Sun. I was very fortunate, Ayana, to get a second shot playing Walter Lee, because I had played Walter Lee some years earlier in a production of A Raisin in the Sun at Yale Rep, and I wasn't very good.
Let me ask you about that, because I'm curious. I heard you said that before in an interview that I watched.
I wasn't.
And so I guess one of my questions is like, what is a good performance to you and what is not? Like, what is the difference between this successful performance and the one that wasn't? And why do you say, like, to yourself, that wasn't a good performance?
All right.
You know, because we're talking about rigor, we're talking about craft, like what, and without getting, you know, I mean, we're not, all the audience won't be actors, but what is that? What is your perception of good or successful?
I was intimidated the first time playing Walter Lee at Yale Rep. I was intimidated by the part. I had this tape playing in my head. Excuse me. I had this tape playing in my head. Excuse me. That I wasn't good enough. I wasn't up for the part, and I couldn't erase this tape. In that production, icons. Mama was played by an actor named Bea Richards. Bea Richards had played Sidney Poitier's mother in Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Bea came from a long tradition of doing solid work. Bea Richards played Mama. The lady I mentioned earlier, Mary Alice, played my wife. Just incredibly
extraordinary,
just formidable actors. I had this tape in my head, you don't belong here. And I couldn't erase it. So that seeped into my work. And I would say that by closing night, I was probably at 65% of what Walter Lee could and should be. So it was fortuitous that Robert Nemiroff didn't hold it against me and called me a couple of years later and said, do you want to come and do this? I said, yes. So we go to the Kennedy Center. And my approach to playing Walter Lee the second time was much different.
Why? Was it because you were older? Was it because you weren't so green?
No. I'll tell you exactly what I did. I'll tell you exactly what was different. I flew to Chicago, Lorraine Hansberry's hometown. And I walked the streets of Chicago. I went to Lorraine Hansberry's old neighborhood. I went to her house. I didn't go inside, but I literally went to the street where she was raised. And I was just hoping to, by osmosis, I wanted to seep into me the city of Chicago and what it meant to be from Chicago. Also, critically, somebody introduced me to a man named Oscar Brown Jr. Incredible. We lost Oscar Brown a few years ago, but Oscar Brown Jr., Renaissance man, jazz performer, poet, writer from Chicago. Oscar Brown Jr. Graciously invited me into his home, and I spent all afternoon with him, all afternoon and evening, and he just schooled me about what Chicago was like in the late 1950s, which is when the play is set. So I was educating myself differently for the second, educating and preparing myself more fully to go and do this second production of A Raisin in the Sun. Fast forward, the Kennedy Center production of A Raisin in the Sun, which also starred Esther Roll as another icon who had started at the Negro Ensemble Company, known to most of your audience as, I think it was That's My Mama, whatever it was that Jimmy Walker was in.
Good Times.
Good Times, thank you. Good Times. Esther Roll played Mama. I'm forgetting some of the names of the other actors. Starletta Dupois, Stephen McKinley Henderson was in that production. A huge hit at the Kennedy Center. The production closed. I then went back to do the second production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone. Second production, after the second production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone closed, I went back to Los Angeles to do a follow-up production of A Raisin in the Sun, the same production that we had done at the Kennedy Center. When the Los Angeles production of A Raisin in the Sun closed, I went back to another production of Joe Turner's Come and Gone. So between Walter Lee Younger and Herald Loomis, these are big contemporary classical parts, emotionally, physically, vocally. They are on par, as far as I am concerned, with anything that Shakespeare has written. These are big classical parts. And my process of being able to go back and forth in that 2-year period with those two big parts changed me and improved me exponentially as an actor. It changed my approach to working. I would get to the theater an hour and a half before half hour. In the theater, if you have an 8 o'clock curtain, it means you must be there by 7:30. I would get to the theater an hour and a half before half hour, and I would start my physical and vocal warm-up so that I was ready to negotiate this work. And so the third production, so in Joe Turner's Come, 2 productions of A Raisin in the Sun, Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., and then Los Angeles. 5 productions of Joe Turner between 1986 and 1988, Boston, Seattle, Washington, D.C., the San Diego's Old Globe Theater, and then the Broadway production. I changed as an actor. It's almost as if my DNA as an actor changed because I had been challenged by these huge parts. One last story and then I'll stop talking. Right before we went to Broadway, and this is after I had done 4 productions over 2 years. Right before we went to Broadway, August Wilson came to, I'd done 4 productions, and August Wilson came to me and said, "You're getting it now, man. You're getting it now." That's how long it took me to get up to speed with Herald Loomis.
Right.
But to your original question, the fact that I, in my estimation, changed exponentially my belief in myself. When you have success as an actor, I had success the second time I played Walter Lee. Even though the reviews, my reviews for Joe Turner's Come and Gone was somewhat spotty leading up to Broadway, I knew I was on the right path. I knew I was on the right track with the part. And that's internal, and that constitutes success. My internal assessment of my own work and my own progress inside the work, in addition to the impacts that it was having on audiences. I can't tell you, Ayana, a number of times with Joe Turner, people would wait at the stage door, and the actors would come out, whichever theater we were working in. And I remember one gentleman saying, "Man, I couldn't move at the end of the play. I just sat there. I couldn't move. You touched me. You touched me." When I was on Broadway one evening, Lou Gossett came, icon, hero. I went down into the green room, and I didn't know Lou at that point. Lou Gossett came and saw a performance. I went down into the green room, and Lou Gossett, icon, hero. Lou Gossett says to me, "You showed me something tonight, man."
Wow.
That's all he said. He said, "You showed me something tonight."
Wow.
That kind of affirmation, Ayana, on top of the fact that I know that I'm working as optimally as I know how inside of this work. But when somebody like Lou Gossett comes and says, you showed me something. I know I'm doing something right. I talked and talked and talked and talked once again. I don't even know what your original question was.
No, it's wonderful. This is what the point of this is. It's to talk about things that are the most meaningful in your evolution and to your evolution, you know?
Can I just say one other thing to all the artists out there, all the creative people out there, to all workers out there who may be watching Ayana and I, the lesson for each of us has to do with how we establish barometers for ourselves. And we should be the arbiters of what success is for ourselves, nothing outside of us. No entity is outside. We should be the arbiters of our own journeys. And that's critical. And I cannot stress that enough. And that is for all workers out there, no matter what field of endeavor one is in. You set the bar for yourself. We set the bars for ourselves. And we engage in rigorous exercises, rigorous processes for ourselves. But we ultimately are the judges of what constitutes success.
Thank you for that. It was one of the, there were a couple of things that I was thinking about. One was that, and I guess I'm in a way, I'm sort of fast forwarding like into the 90s as you start getting film work and
sure.
And you're working with Spike Lee and you're doing stuff like Get Shorty and you're doing, you know, but this dovetails really nicely because I started to think about when the path starts to widen, right, and you begin to have more choices, right, because there's a point when you're starting off, you know, as an artist that it's sort of like your choice is to pay the rent or not pay the rent, right, you know, and then at a certain point you know, and so I wanted to ask, and in a certain way, maybe you've already answered this partially, sort of what guides those choices that you were making, you know, is it career considerations, is it your growth as an artist? Is it fame, which is very seductive for a young person?
It's absolutely not fame. I can tell you that right now. It's absolutely not fame.
What are those things? Not fame.
Okay, all right. As a young actor working in the theater, the barometer that I used was, will this challenge me as an actor? I very simply, I went wherever I was offered work. In the 80s, there was this idea that floating around in New York, well, you know, don't leave New York because you know, an opportunity, an off-Broadway opportunity may come up, a Broadway opportunity may come. Don't leave, you got to be ready. And if that opportunity comes and you're working in the regional theater somewhere, you lose that opportunity. And I never adhered to that, Ayana. I went where I was offered work. And the reason that I went wherever I was offered work is because I wanted to, I wanted to keep working. I wanted to challenge myself as an actor. And I also thought that this was the way that I would grow as an actor. Go and do the work. By going to do this work that I did Shakespeare in the regions. I did Ethel Fugard in the regions. I did Sam Art Williams in the regions, right? Because I wanted to just simply, yes, I wanted to keep working, but I also, equally importantly, I wanted to keep challenging myself as an actor. Now, did I analyze it in those kinds of terms back then? Not per se, but what I knew was if Theater X in Norfolk, Virginia offers me a job and I'm interested in that work, I'm going to do that work. If they want me, I want to go. I'm not waiting in New York for the possibility that some job might show up. No, I wanted to continue working, and that's what I did. Now, fast forward to your question, what are the considerations as I started now doing film? Let me say unequivocally, fame was never, ever a consideration. Ever for me. The my credo to myself.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a human being that I can contribute to?
Mm-hmm.
If I'm offered something, whether it's screenplay or something in television, is this something, you know, that interests me?
Mm-hmm.
If they want me, do I want to be a part of this? And can I illuminate the human condition?
Mm-hmm.
Can I do something that illuminates the human condition? And that sounds so extraordinarily something. But I have transitioned from theater can change the world,
mm-hmm.
which maybe it can and maybe it can't.
Mm-hmm.
Transition from that to, can I impact my fellow human beings in some way?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I'll settle for that. I'll settle for, you know, having some impact on my fellow human beings.
Well, that's not small, right?
And that's not small. That's not small. So there are a number of factors. At some point, at certain times, I'm offered something. What's the size of my bank account? Do I need the money?
Sure.
And absolutely, I have done things for money. Incidentally,
thank you for saying, because sometimes we get into the realm of art. You know, it's like everybody wants to pretend that people are filling the refrigerator with ideals, but you know, also anyway, go ahead. Yeah.
There's always art and commerce.
Yeah,
always.
Yeah.
For any creative worker, as you know, as all the people who may be listening, there's always art and commerce, and one is always having to balance those two realities. And I am certainly no exception. At certain points, I've done things because I needed to make the money. At some points, I've done things because I am really excited about the work. It varies. There's a whole host of, there's a range of reasons why one does a certain work at a certain point in time. For me, what I will say is, unfortunately for me, whenever I have done something for money, it's tended to backfire on me. So I've had to learn to be really clear why I am engaging in a particular piece of work, and try to be really rigorous with myself as to why I'm doing that work, so that I can keep focused, so that if creatively either something goes off the rails or something is not quite as satisfying as I would like, I have to remember, why did you do this job? Why did you take this job? And that helps me keep some sanity. So my answer to your question is, it really varies why one takes work.
Or not, yeah.
And also I will tell you this, you mentioned choices, having choices. I've never had those kinds of luxuries. Maybe in the last couple of years, it's changed slightly. And I will tell you, and whomever else is listening, and I've said this to friends of mine, you know, I've been doing this for over 40 years. And this year, as I speak to you right now, is the first time in my career, literally the first time, that I know what I'm doing for the next year.
And is that because of Bloods, do you think, in part?
Yeah, absolutely because of Bloods. 7,000% because of Bloods. No question. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
So there's two questions come to mind. One feels a little off center, but I was thinking about it so much when I was thinking about talking to you, that I think I'm going to try and sort of fit it in. And this has to do with the body, actually. And the body is like an actor's instrument, like the sort of physical self, right?
The physical self, yeah.
And I'm really interested in the ways in which Black bodies sort of navigate these spaces, theater, television, film casting offices, you know, all of these kinds of things. And to maybe sort of make this a little bit easier to answer and not so general, I wondered if, and it's important to say, you know, that you are of imposing stature. I mean, you're 6'2", you're like a big man, you know? And so I was wondering if you have found, and maybe you haven't, if you have a greater sort of physical ease in spaces, let's say like a Spike Lee film or like The Harder They Fall, as opposed to films that are more predominantly white kind of spaces. I mean, you know, we talk a lot about all of the politics around Black bodies, but I actually wanted just to talk about sort of the sort of physical experience of moving through these places, because we don't actually talk about that very much. And as an actor, that's so primary. I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the short answer is yes, I am more comfortable. I don't, although I have to say that it's not just a physical phenomenon. Mm-hmm. The two films that you mentioned, you mentioned Spike Lee films, and you mentioned The Harder They Fall. Mm-hmm. With Spike, and I've said this numerous times over the years, the comfort that Spike Lee provides me whenever I've worked with Spike is that I never feel that I have to translate what he is saying to me. Does he mean this? Does he mean that? I understand. Mm-hmm. Now, it doesn't mean we don't have disagreements in the process, but the analogy that I always use is he and I are always on the same train, going in the same direction. Mm-hmm. I'm always on the same train. So there's a comfort that in actuality is psychological and emotional, and that translates physically in terms of physically how I move in the world of a Spike Lee film. That's one thing. Similarly with The Harder They Fall, because I considered and I consider The Harder They Fall a very important film, just from the standpoint of presenting to audiences that Black people were in the Old West.
Which
as a young person, I had no clue, right?
Me neither. Many of us didn't. Many of us didn't.
So just in those terms alone, it's an important film. And then we have the passion and the vision of James Samuels wanting to present a certain story a certain way with us African descended people at the core of the storytelling. Of course, I don't need to translate that. It resonates for me organically, and that in turn translates physically how I negotiate the workspace. In addition, with The Harder They Fall, I was so Bass Reeves, to get to play Bass Reeves, who I'd never heard of before doing the film. And here I am, and I start to research, and this was a monumental man of the law who happened to be African-American, who happened to be illiterate, who could not read or write, but devised for himself a strategy where he always got his man. Stunning. Just that one fact alone tells me eons about who this person is. My job then becomes, how do I excavate that and present, just in terms of my own creative process, and present a compelling human being. But to your question about navigating the space with Spike and with James on The Harder They Fall, because I considered that these are really important stories. Yes, there are African descended people at the core of the storytelling, but in the final analysis, they're human stories. They are stories that do what? Illuminate the human condition. And that's my reward as an actor. That's exactly what I said I want. right?
Mm-hmm.
From the standpoint of being a big, imposing, dark Black man, yes, I'm aware that there are people who that frightens them, it intimidates them, it all of those things. This is going to sound really pious or something. And I've had to learn. I've had to learn to negotiate those kinds of dynamics, and I'm still learning, frankly. But in the final analysis, Ayana, all I can be is as human as I can be. And that's true for all of us. Because when you think of when you think about African descended people and how our humanity has historically been violated, ignored, erased, expurgated, our humanity denied, just out and out denied our humanity. So all I can do, not to make anybody else comfortable, but to reaffirm for myself that I am not only am I a human being, but I'm a worthy human being. Right? As evidenced by how I carry myself throughout the world, and also how I approach my work as a creative person. And once again, you know, whomever the audience is out there, particularly workers of color, part of the job in the journey has to do with the simple task of affirming our humanity. Affirming our humanity and having our work as an extension of ourselves affirm our humanity. And of course, by that, I mean the exposure, the presenting of our flaws also. You know, we're all flawed human beings, but the point is, there has been such, historically, there has been such attention placed on denying and violating our humanity, up to and including March 23rd, 2022.
Exactly, 7:59 p.m. Absolutely, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons I asked the question, because it's like you're all of us in our bodies, right? We're sort of, you know, I use the term imposing because you're a body that's big, right? You know?
Yes.
But also because you are sort of, in a certain sense, I guess part of what I was thinking about too is that you impose your humanity on the people that are around you. Like, I am undeniably standing in this body, right?
And I'm undeniably
deal with that whatever way they're going to deal with it.
That's right. Because in the final analysis, one is undeniably who one is, and that will not change. Now, I have to be careful here, because I don't want to present that I have all the answers. I don't. You know, I struggle as much as the next person. But going back to your question about the physical, personally, my mandate to myself, this is entirely personal. My mandate to myself, Ayana, has to do with maintaining my physical self as optimally as I am able. Because I feel that will give me the greatest opportunity to express creatively through my body, my mind, and my physical self. So for me, it entails, to your question about the physical body, for me, it involves optimizing, using the greatest way that I am able to keep myself physically viable, as physically strong, as physically dynamic as I am able, because that it is inextricably connected. My physical self is inextricably connected to my mental, my emotional, and my psychological.
Thank you. We are about out of time, but I
Wow.
want to leave us on one. I know I can't. It's unbelievable. I feel like we started talking 5 minutes ago.
Yeah, really.
So I'm gonna leave us with two thoughts, and then I'm gonna have you to kind of take us out. So one thing that I was thinking of, and I wanted to get to some projects of yours that are coming up.
Yes.
One is Anansi Boys, which will be coming out on Amazon. There's Blade with Marvel Studios.
Yeah.
And then and also a directorial project that you are working on now.
Yes. Yes.
So those are all very exciting things that I want everyone to kind of keep in mind and be on the lookout for.
Thank
the
you.
last thing I want to ask you takes us a little bit away from those, but kind of back to the same place, sort of where we started, which was when we started. I was asking you about you having said, I want to be respected as an actor. And I said I would come back around to that.
Yes.
And the way I want to come back around to it is that we talked about Bloods just a little while ago, about the 5 Bloods, and you're saying how it sort of, it changed everything this year for the first time. You know what you're doing for the next year,
Yep.
And so I guess the final question I kind of want you to take us out with is these changes, right? Like it's in your career, changes in your sort of your prospects, perhaps in your agency in a certain way, right? To exert certain forces on things or decide certain things.
Agency over myself. Agency
Exactly.
over, yes.
Exactly.
Uh-huh.
I wondered if you could just talk very briefly about sort of what that means to you at this point, and more largely, what do you do with it? What do you do with this newfound stuff that you've been working towards all these years?
Yeah.
Does it take you closer to that I want to be respected as an actor that you said when you were however many years old, all that time ago?
Yes. I'll answer the last part first, or the second to last part first. What do I do with it? I keep working. It's that simple. I try not to take myself too seriously. I keep my eye on whatever it is that I determine is at the center of the work that I'm engaging, and try to excavate that work as deeply as I know how. That's one thing. That's probably the most important thing. It is, of course, it's an affirmation for me, after all these years, that I'm still in the game. I'm still in the game. I'm still here. I'm still working. And that feels wonderful. But it affirms, over and above that, it on some level affirms the approach and the ethic that I've utilized in my work. And I have indeed, Ayana, achieved what I said I wanted to achieve, based on how people talk to me about what they feel I am as an actor to them. Whether it be mentioning a given piece of work that they like. I can't tell you that, one of the clips you or one of the images you showed was that scene between Denzel and I in Malcolm X. And I can't tell you the numbers of people who say, oh my God, Malcolm X. I can't tell you the numbers of people who say Crooklyn, oh my God, right? Bloods, vets coming up to me and saying, man, 5 Bloods, man, that was me right there. Oh God. I don't have the words, but inherent in all of those affirmations is the respect and the recognition that people have for the work that one has done. So from that standpoint, I have gotten pretty much exactly what I asked for, even when I wasn't quite sure what it meant. But that is, it's enriching. It's an affirmation that one has one's journey has been going in the right direction, And frankly, I want very much for that journey to continue. If in fact I am on a train, I want the train to keep moving. I want the train to keep moving down the track.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm going to say one thing. I'm going to put you on Front Street really quickly. What brought us together, and I'm not going to say too much, but what brought us together was a piece of your work that I read that, as far as I was concerned, was illuminating something about the condition of what it means to be of color, Black, African descended. And you were able in that piece of work to kind of turn it on its head in a way that just resonated for me. That's what brought us together. So I would say the other thing is, the other aspect of this journey is to connect as much as one can with like-minded souls, with like-minded spirits. And that's certainly what brought you and I together initially.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think that was really, it's so wonderful. Thank you for being here. And it's said, you've just said so much about listening to your own internal barometer, you know, and following what your self tells you is successful or is good or is wise. And to end on this note of connection with like-minded others, I think is really tremendous. It's sort of, sometimes in my darkest moments, I think, well, people are all we've got. In any case, thank you so much, Delroy Lindo, for being here. I can't believe how quickly the time went. I want to thank everyone out there for being with us this evening, for this incredible hour of conversation. Please stay tuned. You can follow us. You can follow the Black Arts Dialogues on Instagram and on Twitter. And stay tuned for news for our next program, which will be in the fall. Thank you once again for being here. Thank you once again, Delroy Lindo. I'm Ayana Mathis, and this is the Black Arts Dialogues.
And thank you for everybody who tuned in. God bless. Thank you. Thank you, Ayana.